Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are walking into a place where a single misplaced ribbon could end a career, where the wrong shoe could make you invisible, and where an entire kingdom once organized itself around the question of who was allowed to shine. Tonight, we go to the court of Versailles, and we go there through its clothes. Before we drift off into the 17th century, thank you for being here, night after night. If this is your first time with us, welcome to the family, settle in, get comfortable, and consider hitting subscribe so you never lose your way back to us. And if you've been with us for a while now, you already know what to do. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. We love picturing this show traveling around the globe, whispering people to sleep in dozens of time zones at once. You can also find us now on Spotify, for the nights when you'd rather just close your eyes and listen. And for those who want more, our membership includes extended, ad-free episodes built to carry you gently through an entire long night. Now, lower the lights. Let the world outside go quiet. And loosen anything that's currently squeezing your ribs, because tonight's story is going to make you very grateful that it isn't. Let me ask you something before we begin. What if the clothes in your closet weren't really yours to choose? What if a stranger, a very powerful stranger, decided which colors you were legally permitted to wear, which fabrics belonged to people richer than you, and whether you'd even earn the right to cover your own head in a room? What if your shoes could get you arrested, not for crime, but for presumption? Tonight, you're going to live through a single day inside the most fashion-obsessed institution Europe ever built. And by the end of it, you'll understand something surprising. At Versailles, clothing wasn't decoration. It was government. You wake up in a chamber inside the Palace of Versailles. It is the late 17th century. Outside your window, gravel paths stretch toward fountains that will not run today, because the fountains only perform when someone important is watching, and today, no one important is watching you. You have nothing appropriate to wear. Somewhere down the corridor, a valet is already whispering about it. Let's begin gently with the first ordeal of your day, getting dressed at all, part 2. The architecture of a body back in your own century, getting dressed is a private, almost thoughtless act. You reach for whatever's clean, whatever fits the weather, whatever doesn't have a stain on it. Here at Versailles, dressing yourself is not really something you're allowed to do. It is something that is done to you by a small crew of servants who know your rank better than you do, and who will spend the better part of an hour assembling you like a piece of furniture with opinions. Clothing here is not self-expression. It is closer to a legal notice pinned to your body. Every fabric announces your income. Every color announces your standing. Every cut of a sleeve tells the room whether you belong at the center of court life, or whether you are merely passing through it, a well-dressed tourist who wandered too far into someone else's palace. And because the entire court has almost nothing else to do all day but observe one another, they have become experts, ruthless, quiet, devastatingly accurate experts, at reading a person from the ankles up. You will not dress yourself this morning because you cannot. The garments are constructed with such a maze of ties, hooks, and hidden fastenings that a single person attempting them alone would be defeated within minutes. So hands you don't know descend on you. Linen goes on first, next the stiff foundational layers, then petticoats, then the outer garment, then jewelry, then a final round of adjustments that someone insists cannot be skipped. By the time it's finished, you are wearing what amounts to a small fortune, and lifting your own arm above your shoulder has become a genuine athletic feat. Think about the sheer contrast. At home, your most elaborate morning decision might be whether a shirt is wrinkled enough to iron. Here, getting dressed is closer to being inducted into a rank you haven't earned yet, scored simultaneously on fabric, color, cut, and posture by a jury that never announces its verdict out loud. It just remembers. And this isn't a once-a-day event. The court expects you to change again for the afternoon, again for an evening reception, again if there's a formal audience. Wear too little variety and you look poor. Change too often and you look like you're trying too hard. There is an invisible, correct amount, and nobody will ever simply tell you what it is. You will only find out you got it wrong when you notice, from across a candle-lit room, that someone is smiling at your sleeves in a way that isn't friendly. Now let's talk about the one garment that half the men at court would trade a fortune to own. A coat you are almost certainly not allowed to wear. Part 3. A jacket worth more than gold somewhere in the palace tonight. A small circle of men, never more than a few dozen at any given time, are wearing an unmistakable blue coat, lined in scarlet, heavy with silver and gold thread. It is, by any measure, a beautiful garment, and you cannot have one, not because you can't afford it. Because the king hasn't given you permission. This coat carried a formal name at court, and wearing it required something no amount of money could buy. A signed authorization from the monarch himself. Picture that for a moment, needing royal paperwork to put on a jacket. The king had discovered, quite cleverly, that he could reward loyalty without spending a single coin from the treasury. He simply invented an honor made of fabric. The number of these coats was strictly limited, and that limit was the entire engine of their value. If anyone could own one, it would mean nothing. Because almost no one could, it became the single most desired object at court. Consider the strategy buried inside this. Powerful, wealthy men who already had titles, land, fortunes, spent years angling, flattering, and maneuvering not for money, not for territory, but for the right to wear one particular shade of blue. And it worked spectacularly. To be seen in that coat was to be seen as chosen. You didn't need to explain your closeness to the throne. The coat did it for you silently in threads of gold every time you crossed a room. And if you didn't have one, you got to watch. You got to stand nearby in your perfectly respectable, perfectly ordinary coat and feel the particular sting of wanting something that was, by royal decree, simply not available to you, no matter how much you were worth. Here is the strange truth underneath it all. Strip away the meaning and it was just a coat. Warm, well-made. But structurally no different from 100 other coats in the palace. Its entire power lived in what it represented. Add the meaning back, and you have grown men, dukes, generals, seasoned courtiers, nearly overcome with joy at being handed a piece of outerwear. So know this morning the blue coat is not for you. You haven't earned it. The king has never heard your name, and the men who wear it fought for that privilege for decades. You may admire it respectfully from across the hall, in your own unremarkable clothing like everyone else who wasn't chosen. And speaking of things that instantly reveal your standing without a single word spoken, let's look down. At your shoes, part 4. What your heels are saying about you, glance downward for a moment, because your feet are about to tell on you. At Versailles, the underside of a heel could be painted a brilliant, glossy red, but only if you belong to a very particular circle. The king wore them. His inner favorites wore them. Everyone else simply noticed quietly and adjusted their behavior accordingly. The red heel wasn't a random fashion whim. It functioned as a kind of silent credential. To have painted heels was to announce, without a single sentence, that you had proximity to the throne, that you had, quite literally, walked close enough to royal favor to be marked by it. Some historians suggest the color carried an even bolder implication, that the wearer was powerful enough to walk over anything or anyone beneath him, immune to the mud and mess of ordinary life. Whatever the precise origin, the social effect was identical. A flash of red beneath a shoe was a small, glossy announcement of rank, repeated with every single step you took. Picture the choreography this created across a crowded room. Courtiers learned to glance down quickly, almost without thinking, the way a modern person might clock a wedding ring or an expensive watch. A red heel told them exactly how deep to bow, how much attention your name deserved, whether you were worth remembering at all. A plain heel told them you were scenery, pleasant enough perhaps, but not worth the effort of true courtesy. And here is the cruelest detail. Wealth alone could not buy you red heels. You could own more silk, more jewels, more land than half the men wearing them, and it wouldn't matter because red heels were never about money. They were about favor, and favor at Versailles was notoriously unstable. In favor this month, your heels gleaming proudly across the marble floors. Fall out of favor the next, and suddenly those same heels became a small, quiet humiliation, evidence of a status you no longer held. Did people repaint them? Hide them? History doesn't record every awkward moment, but you can imagine the discomfort easily enough. you check your own shoes. Plain, unremarkable, painfully honest about exactly where you stand. You are, in footwear terms, a nobody, and in a hall built entirely of mirrors, everybody can see it. Now, let's move upward from your feet to your ribs and to the gown specifically engineered to make both of them suffer. Part 5. The cage beneath the gown. If you are a woman waking up inside Versailles this morning, prepare yourself, because it is time for the grand ceremonial gown, the most formal dress at court, and quite possibly the most punishing piece of clothing ever devised by someone who had clearly never had to wear it. Picture a bodice reinforced with rigid bonding, crushing your midsection into a narrow, fashionable point. Picture sleeves so fitted they pin your arms close to your body. Picture a neckline cut low enough to leave your shoulders bare to the palace's famously unheated air. You will not slouch today. You will barely sit. And you will do all of this while maintaining a pleasant, untroubled expression, as though your ribs are not currently negotiating for their lives. This gown was reserved for the most formal occasions. The moments when looking as though you belonged at the very summit of society mattered more than anything else, including comfort. The bodice was laced so tightly and stiffened so thoroughly that your torso essentially stopped being a flexible part of your body and became something closer to architecture. You didn't wear this dress so much as get installed inside it. The sleeves alone deserve a moment of sympathy. Tight, structured, and often positioned in ways that limited your reach, they turned ordinary gestures, pointing, waving, adjusting your hair, into small, careful operations. Large, sweeping movements simply weren't available to you anymore. Your body's natural range of motion had been quietly confiscated the moment the servants finished lacing you in. Then there's the neckline, cut low and wide in the name of elegance, leaving your shoulders and upper chest exposed in a palace that was notoriously difficult to heat. Versailles was an enormous stone structure with drafts that moved freely through its endless corridors, and comfort was never a design priority. So you stood there, half exposed, radiating dignity in one direction and goosebumps in the other. Sitting down became its own small crisis. With your torso locked rigidly in place, dropping into a chair the way you might at home simply wasn't possible. You learned to perch, to lean, to arrange yourself against furniture in a way that suggested rest without ever fully achieving it. Long court ceremonies turned into quiet endurance tests, hours of standing, punctuated by careful, shallow attempts at sitting, while your ribs filed a continuous, unanswered complaint. And through every second of it, you were expected to look entirely at ease. The whole design philosophy of this gown was to make extraordinary discomfort appear effortless, to glide through an evening of genuine physical agony as though you were having the time of your life. The suffering was meant to be invisible. Only the elegance was meant to show. Compare this to your evening wear back home, where dressing up might mean choosing the pair of pants without the elastic waistband, and even that can feel like a small sacrifice. The women of Versailles laced themselves into rigid frames of bone and wire and stood for hours in the cold, smiling the entire time. It makes your fanciest outfit look, by comparison, like pajamas. Now, if you think the gown itself was expensive, wait until you hear what it was sometimes made from. Part 6. Wearing actual treasure. At the very top of the Versailles wardrobe hierarchy sat something almost absurd in its literalness: fabric woven with real threads of gold and silver. Cloth that didn't just look expensive, it was expensive, glittering under candlelight like the wearer had been dipped in treasure. Naturally, everyone at court wanted to shine this brightly. And just as naturally, the crown decided that most people shouldn't be allowed to. Craftsmen wove genuine precious metal into thread, then into fabric, producing a material that threw candlelight back across a room in a way ordinary silk never could. A person dressed in cloth of gold didn't simply look wealthy, they looked lit from within, radiant in a way that struck the eye before it registered in the brain. It wasn't clothing so much as a walking spectacle. The problem from the crown's perspective was obvious. Spectacle is competitive. If any sufficiently rich noble could drape themselves in shimmering metal cloth, the entire visual hierarchy of the court, the whole delicate system of who outranked whom, would collapse into an undignified contest of who could outsparkle everyone else. And the last thing an absolute monarch wants is to arrive at his own reception and discover an ambitious count has quietly outglittered him. So limits appeared. Rules governing who could wear these fabrics, in what quantity, and on which occasions, kept the brightest materials clustered appropriately around royalty and the highest nobility, thinning out as you moved down the social ladder. Your position in society was meant to be legible simply by how much light you reflected across a room. This turned fabric into a kind of currency, and like any currency, it was jealously guarded. To wear more gold thread than your rank technically permitted wasn't just a fashion misstep. It was a quiet overreach, a visual claim to importance you hadn't been granted, and it would be noticed by exactly the people you least wanted noticing. And even setting the rules aside entirely, these fabrics represented a genuine fortune. A single garment could be worth an amount that might otherwise purchase land, livestock, or the loyalty of a small private army. Instead, it bought you one evening of glowing in front of a room full of people silently calculating its price. Think about the strangeness of it. Gold, the substance nations went to war over, woven into a jacket, worn to a party, then hung on a hook at the end of the night. Your single most valuable possession wasn't locked away for safekeeping. It was something you wore on your body and sweated into. So you shine, if you're permitted to shine, strictly within the boundaries your rank allows, always aware that the brightest light in any room legally belongs to someone else. Now let's talk about a substance so contested it started something close to an economic war: lace. Part 7. The Battle Over Lace. Lace was everywhere at Versailles, foaming from cuffs, spilling over collars, trimming nearly every visible edge of fabric. But not just any lace. At some point the crown noticed something troubling. Nobles were spending enormous sums importing delicate lace from foreign centers of craftsmanship, and that money was leaving France permanently. The solution was direct: discourage the foreign product, build a domestic lace industry, and treat a smuggled foreign collar with real suspicion. Yes, you could genuinely find yourself in trouble over your neckwear. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand how labor-intensive fine lace actually was. Producing it by hand required enormous skill and enormous time, which made it naturally precious, and precious things inevitably become status symbols. The court wore it everywhere it could possibly be attached, each delicate layer quietly announcing how much its owner could afford. For a long stretch of history, the very finest lace came from renowned centers of craftsmanship abroad, places whose artisans had spent generations perfecting the technique. And here was the crown's real headache. Every time a French noble purchased an exquisite imported collar, French wealth flowed straight into a rival economy. Multiply that by an entire court obsessed with lace, and you have a genuine, ongoing drain on the kingdom's money, leaking out one fashionable collar at a time. The response was equal parts economic strategy and fashion policy. Rather than simply complain about the problem, the crown worked to establish a domestic lace industry, importing skilled craftspeople, encouraging French production, and discouraging the foreign competition through a mix of restriction and social pressure. If the nobility was determined to spend fortunes on lace, that money would now stay inside French borders. This gave imported lace a faint whiff of the illicit. Wearing the wrong lace, the foreign kind, became, whether intended or not, a small quiet act of defiance against royal economic policy. Picture the scene: a fully jeweled, silk-draped aristocrat, privately anxious that someone might recognize their collar came from the wrong country. It's perhaps the most extravagant version imaginable of getting caught with contraband, and the contraband is decorative fabric holes. And people genuinely paid attention. In a court where everyone scrutinized everyone else constantly, the origin and quality of your lace became one more detail up for judgment. Where the approved French lace, and you were both fashionable and loyal. Show up in the forbidden foreign variety, and you were, intentionally or not, making a statement about where your priorities lay. There's a real cleverness buried in this. The crown had effectively turned noble vanity into a functioning national industry. All that competitive desire to look impressive got quietly redirected into funding France's own craftsmen. The nobility believed they were simply dressing well. In practice, they were financing a national economic project one frothy cuff at a time. So you check your own lace nervously this morning, hoping it passes inspection, hoping no sharp-eyed rival questions its origin. Anywhere else, lace is simply pretty trim. At Versailles, it was policy, patriotism, and potential scandal, all knotted together in a single collar. And if lace could land you in trouble, wait until you hear which colors were quietly off-limits entirely. Part 8. A rainbow with a class system. At Versailles, even color came with rules. Certain shades, deep, rich, extraordinarily difficult to produce, were understood without needing to be written down anywhere to belong exclusively to people important enough to wear them. A particular royal blue, a specific deep purple, the richest possible reds. These weren't simply pretty options on a dyer's chart. They were statements, and making the wrong statement in the wrong color could feel like showing up somewhere solemn dressed for a celebration. The reasoning traces back to production. In an age before easy synthetic dyes, achieving a truly vivid, saturated color required rare ingredients and painstaking, skilled labor. That difficulty made the richest shades naturally expensive. A deep, glowing color announced wealth before it announced anything else, simply because ordinary people could never afford to produce or purchase it. This scarcity sorted colors into an informal but powerful hierarchy. The rarest, most difficult shades became associated, not always through written law, but through deeply understood custom, with the highest ranks of society. To wear them without the standing to justify it was to reach for something that wasn't yours, and everyone in the room would notice the reach. Purple in particular carried centuries of accumulated association with royalty and power, precisely because producing the finest versions was so rare and so costly. Deep reds and certain brilliant blues carried similar weight. These weren't casual choices. They were claims, and claims that outran your actual position in society were genuinely risky things to make in a place this obsessed with hierarchy. So you learned to read an entire room simply by its palette, a sea of muted, modest tones, punctuated by a handful of brilliant, saturated figures at the center, told you instantly where the real power was standing. The vivid colors marked the important people. Everyone else formed a careful, tasteful backdrop, dressed in shades that didn't overstep. Imagine the quiet anxiety this created around something as simple as choosing a fabric you loved. You'd have to stop and ask yourself, am I actually allowed to wear this? Does this shade make me look confident, or does it make me look delusional about my own standing? A decision that should have been purely joyful became a small strategic gamble, and the penalty for guessing wrong wasn't an official fine, it was something worse. It was the quiet, devastating judgment of an entire court, whispered behind fans, remembered for years. Compare this to your own closet, where the boldest question you face is whether a color clashes with your shoes. At Versailles, the question was whether a color could quietly damage your entire social standing. That's an enormous amount of responsibility to place on a die. Now let's move from what you wore to what you were required to strap to your side, whether you had any idea how to use it or not. Part 9. A sword you will never draw. At Versailles, a gentleman did not leave his chambers without a dress sword at his hip. Not for fighting, heaven forbid you actually used it, but because it was simply required, a small badge announcing that you were a person of standing and not someone who'd wandered in off the road. The palace took this so seriously that visitors who arrived without a proper sword could rent one at the entrance, along with an appropriate hat, just to be granted entry. Imagine being turned away from the grandest building in Europe and told, essentially, no sword, No admission, though we do keep spares. The dress sword functioned first and foremost as a symbol. It marked its wearer as belonging to a class entitled to carry a weapon as a matter of identity, not necessity. A gentleman wore his sword the way he wore his rank, openly, as a statement about who he was. To appear without one was to appear incomplete, regardless of how many other layers of finery you had on. There's something genuinely strange in this. The sword was mandatory, non-negotiable, and yet actually drawing it inside the palace would have been an unthinkable scandal. This was a weapon that existed almost entirely as declaration. It hung at your side doing nothing, saying everything. The rental arrangement captures the absurdity perfectly. The symbol mattered so much more than the substance that the palace would rather lend you the credentials of a gentleman than turn you away for lacking them. Nobody checked whether you could actually fence, whether you understood the weapon at all, whether you had any real claim to it beyond a small fee. They checked only that it was present, hanging correctly, completing the picture. The image of a gentleman could, quite literally, be rented by the hour. This tells you almost everything about how Versailles operated. It was a stage, and everyone standing on it was expected to be properly costumed. The sword was one required piece of that costume, important enough that the palace would rather lend you one than let you disrupt the performance by showing up without it. So this morning, you strap on your own borrowed blade, purely decorative, faintly ridiculous, and step forward feeling marginally more legitimate than you did 5 minutes ago. It's remarkable how much confidence a completely useless weapon can provide. Now that you're armed with a sword you'll never draw, let's discuss an object even more socially exhausting. One you'll spend the entire day holding and almost never actually wearing. Part 10. The full-time job of a hat. You'd assume a hat is simple. It goes on your head. At Versailles, the hat becomes something closer to a full-time occupation. There were elaborate, unspoken rules governing exactly when you were permitted to wear it, when you were required to remove it entirely, and when the only safe option was to tuck it under your arm like a small, fashionable pet. Get it wrong in front of the king, and you'd insulted the most powerful man in the country. Get it wrong in front of a duke, and you might have just started a feud that would outlive you both. The hat served as a tool of hierarchy, and its position at any given moment communicated something precise about the relationship between everyone present. Removing it, keeping it on, or holding it in a particular way was a way of acknowledging rank without saying a single word, a silent language you were expected to be fluent in. In the king's presence, the rules were absolute and unforgiving. Uncovering your head was a mark of respect, and the exact circumstances governing when to remove your hat, when you might replace it, and how long you were expected to remain uncovered were specific and tangled. A single misjudgment could read as arrogance to some observers and ignorance to others, neither of which you could afford in front of the most powerful man in France. And the king was only the beginning. The court was full of people occupying every conceivable rank, and each interaction carried its own version of hat protocol. Someone above you warranted one set of courtesies. Someone below you warranted another. Two nobles of uncertain relative standing could turn a simple hallway greeting into a delicate, silent negotiation conducted entirely through headwear. This is precisely why the hat spent so much of its life tucked under an arm rather than actually worn. Carrying it was often simply the safest option, present and correct, without risking the offense of wearing it at the wrong moment in front of the wrong person. Picture the constant mental arithmetic this demanded. Walk into any room, and you had to instantly calculate who outranked you, who didn't, and what your hat was therefore obligated to do. A wrong answer wasn't a small thing. It rippled outward into resentment, into the kind of long, quiet grudge that Versailles nobles were famous for nursing for years over the smallest perceived slight. Compare this to your own relationship with hats, where the entire etiquette amounts to maybe removing it indoors, if you happen to remember. At Versailles, Your hat was a delicate instrument of social survival, requiring constant vigilance. Now, let's turn to the ladies again, and to a garment so wide it turned walking through an ordinary doorway into an athletic event. Part 11. Wider than the furniture. It's time to discuss panniers, the side hoops worn beneath a woman's skirts, which over the decades grew from modest to extravagant to genuinely dangerous. At their most extreme, court gowns became so wide that women had to turn sideways to pass through doorways, navigate crowded rooms with real strategic planning, and sit using specific techniques designed to prevent the entire structure from flipping upward. Picture attending a party while wearing something like a coffee table strapped to each hip, and doing it gracefully, in silk, while pretending it's the most natural thing in the world. Panniers were structures worn beneath the gown to extend the skirt dramatically outward at the sides, while remaining relatively flat from front to back. The resulting silhouette made the wearer occupy an enormous amount of horizontal space, displaying vast quantities of expensive fabric across the widened skirt. And as you've already learned, displaying fabric was very much the entire point. The trend, predictably, didn't know when to stop. What began as a modest widening escalated over the years into genuinely extreme proportions, with the grandest court gowns reaching widths that look almost cartoonish by modern standards. The more formal the occasion, the wider the skirt, until a woman in full court dress commanded a footprint that made ordinary movement a genuine challenge. This created a whole category of physical problems requiring real skill to solve gracefully. Doorways built for normally proportioned humans became small obstacles, requiring careful sideways maneuvering. Furniture had to be navigated with real spatial awareness. Sitting down became an art form of its own. You couldn't simply drop into a chair while wearing a rigid structure jutting outward on both sides. The hoops had to be managed, the fabric arranged, the whole apparatus lowered with enough control that it wouldn't flip upward or collide with the person seated beside you. And through all of it, the expectation remained total serenity. A woman was meant to glide through these challenges as though they didn't exist, turning, sitting, rising with apparent ease, betraying no sign of the constant physical calculation her outfit demanded. The difficulty was meant to stay invisible. Only the grace was meant to show. Imagine the logistics of a crowded formal gathering, an entire room of people wearing these vast structures, all trying to mingle and bow and converse without colliding. It must have resembled a slow, silent dance of avoidance, bodies orbiting each other at a distance dictated entirely by the width of their clothing. Compare this to your own life, where the greatest spatial challenge of getting dressed might be deciding whether a bag counts as a carry-on. The women of Versailles strapped furniture to their hips and still managed to navigate an entire palace with poise. You've never once had to turn sideways to respect a doorway. And speaking of things that grew absurdly large and simply refused to stop, let's look upward, to the powdered spectacle sitting on top of everyone's head. Part 12. The Indoor Snowfall. Let's climb all the way to the top of the outfit, to hair that at Versailles barely belonged to the person wearing it. Enormous curled wigs towered over the court, dusted regularly with clouds of fine white powder to achieve the fashionable pale look. From a distance, it looked elegant. Up close, it meant the entire palace was gently snowing, all day, every day. Powder settled on shoulders. It settled on food. It settled on furniture and on everyone standing nearby. You were, in effect, attending the most glamorous social event in Europe while slowly being dusted like a pastry headed for the oven. And removing the wig to check what was underneath was simply out of the question, because, to put it delicately, regular hair washing was not a common habit of the era. The fashion for elaborate wigs began at the very top, with royalty, and the court followed with the enthusiasm of people who understood that imitation was the safest possible form of flattery. Soon, no gentleman of standing would be seen without a grand cascade of curls. The bigger and more impressive, the better, a towering symbol of status perched on the head like a soft, curled crown. Then came the powder, which turned an already elaborate accessory into a genuine daily production. The desired pale, ghostly look required dusting the wig thoroughly with fine starch-based powder, and powder, as anyone who has ever used it knows, does not stay put. It drifted onto shoulders, collars, and every nearby surface, coating the immediate vicinity in a soft white film. Applying it required its own dedicated ritual, often performed in special rooms, with cloths held over the face to avoid coating it entirely, while clouds of powder billowed through the air. Now consider the hygiene underneath all this. Regular bathing was uncommon, washing one's actual hair even more so, and the wig sat atop a scalp that had likely not encountered soap and water in a genuinely uncomfortable stretch of time. The wigs themselves accumulated their own history of powder, scent, and general wear. Beneath the curls and the elegant dusting lay a reality best left undescribed, which is precisely why nobody described it, and nobody removed the wig to double-check. The scent situation, predictably, was handled the way most unpleasant realities at Versailles were handled, with generous, determined applications of perfume, layered over whatever the powder and the unwashed hair were quietly doing underneath. So your magnificent head of hair this morning is really a layered achievement of starch, curls, and fragrance, each element working hard to cover for the one beneath it, the whole structure balanced precariously on a foundation nobody wanted to examine too closely. Compare this to your own hair, washable anytime you like, in hot running water with products designed specifically for the purpose, and then simply left alone. No powder, no wig, no gentle indoor snowfall settling onto your dinner plate. Now, let's talk about the ladies' version of going too tall, a hairstyle so ambitious that even the king himself reportedly begged everyone to stop wearing it. Part 13. The Tower That Defied a King. Now for a hairstyle so ambitiously tall it briefly seemed to defy gravity itself, the towering style known to history as the Fontanges. For a stretch of years, the fashionable women of the court piled lace, ribbon, and wire into elaborate structures atop their heads, each one climbing a little higher than the last, as the trend spiraled increasingly out of control. And here's the wonderful part. The king himself reportedly grew to despise it. And still, the style refused to die for years. Because apparently, there is one force in France more stubborn than an absolute monarch, and that force is a fashion craze that has developed a will of its own. The origin story, as it's traditionally told, is almost charming in its accidental nature. A lady of the court, so the tale goes, found her hair coming loose during some outdoor activity and improvised a quick fix, tying it up with a ribbon in a style that happened to catch the king's approving eye. And that, at Versailles, was all it took. A hasty emergency solution, noticed and admired by the right person, instantly became the law of fashion through sheer imitation. What began as a simple ribbon quickly evolved into something far more architectural. Women started building the style upward, layering in lace, ribbons, and supportive wire frames to hold up ever taller arrangements. Height became the entire competition, each fashionable woman reaching a little higher than her neighbor, until the structures perched atop court hairstyles grew into genuinely towering creations. The wire frames were the real engine of escalation. Once you had structural support, there was no natural limit imposed by the hair itself anymore. You could simply keep building tier after tier of lace and ribbon rising skyward, a delicate tower held together as much by engineering as by styling. This produced exactly the practical problems you'd expect from wearing a tower on your head. Doorways and carriages became fresh obstacles, this time in the vertical direction, rather than the horizontal one Panniers had already complicated. The taller the fashion climbed, the more precarious it became, until the whole enterprise seemed to exist mainly to prove that its wearer was willing to endure any inconvenience in the name of fashionable height. And then comes the delicious twist in the story. The very king whose early approval had launched the trend eventually grew tired of it entirely. He is said to have made his displeasure known, wishing the ladies of his court would abandon the towering style for something more moderate. And here you see the genuine limits of even absolute royal power. The king wanted it gone, and it simply didn't vanish. It lingered, tall and stubborn, for years afterward. There's something wonderfully human buried in that detail. A king who could reshape the machinery of an entire kingdom with a signature could not immediately kill a hairstyle. Fashion, it turns out, answers to its own momentum, driven by the collective vanity of an entire court, and it doesn't always take orders, even royal ones. Compare this to your own hair, which answers to nothing more demanding than the weather outside. The women of Versailles built towers their own king openly resented, and wore them anyway for years. Now, let's move from towering excess to something far more solemn: the strict, almost bureaucratic rules governing how you were required to dress for grief. Part 14. Grief on a Schedule. At Versailles, even sorrow came with a dress code. When someone of importance died, the court entered a period of official mourning, and mourning arrived with rules so precise they might make a modern accountant weep with recognition. The exact color required, the fabric permitted, how deep or how muted the black needed to be, and how long you were expected to maintain it. All of it was dictated by your rank and your relationship to the deceased. There were even formal stages, moving gradually from the heaviest, most somber fabrics toward slightly lighter ones as time passed. You didn't simply feel sad. You dressed sad, correctly, according to a schedule, and heaven help you if you brightened your wardrobe before the calendar permitted it. Mourning at court functioned as a formal institution rather than a private emotion. When a significant figure died, especially a member of the royal family, the entire court was expected to visibly observe mourning, transforming the usual riot of color and sparkle into a coordinated sea of somber, regulated gloom. Grief became a collective, enforced performance, with everyone participating whether or not they felt any personal sorrow at all. The rules governed everything. Dark, muted tones dominated naturally, but so did fabric texture. Dull, matte materials that absorbed light rather than reflecting it suited the deepest stage of mourning, while shinier, richer materials were reserved for later phases or lesser occasions. The entire visual language of the court recalibrated toward sorrow, precisely and by the book. Rank and relationship determined the specifics, how closely you were connected to the deceased, and how significant that person had been, shaped exactly how deep your mourning needed to be and how long it needed to last. A distant connection warranted a lighter observance. A close one demanded something far heavier. The rules mapped the invisible web of court relationships directly onto fabric, so that your clothing announced not just that someone had died, but precisely how much that death was officially supposed to affect you. Then came the staged progression. Mourning wasn't a single unchanging state. It moved, over a defined period, from the heaviest and gloomiest materials toward gradually lighter ones as the prescribed timeline unfolded. You transitioned through these stages on schedule, shedding the deepest gloom in increments. Each step permitted only once sufficient time had passed. This meant you could get it wrong in either direction. Cling too long to the heaviest mourning attire, and you risked seeming to overstate your closeness to the deceased, an unseemly display. Lighten your wardrobe too soon, switching to a less severe fabric before the calendar allowed, and you risked appearing callous, insufficiently affected, disrespectful. There was a correct pace to visible grief, and deviating from it in either direction would be noticed and judged, exactly like everything else at Versailles. Consider how strange this really is. Your genuine, private feelings about a death were essentially beside the point. What mattered was the correct outward observance, executed on schedule in the appropriate fabric, for the appropriate duration. Whether you felt nothing at all or were genuinely devastated, your task remained identical: dress the prescribed grief correctly and update it on time. Compare this to your own experience of loss, where you wear whatever feels right, and no one hands you a calendar dictating when you're allowed to stop looking sad. At Versailles, even sorrow was a matter of protocol, staged in regulated fabric on a fixed timeline. Now, let's shrink our focus down to the smallest accessory of all, a tiny black shape that said far more about you than you might expect. Part 15. A message glued to your face. Time for the smallest, most quietly mischievous accessory at court, the beauty patch, small shapes of black silk cut into dots, stars, and crescents, applied directly to the face and neck. Officially, they were purely decorative and conveniently useful for covering the odd blemish or scar. Unofficially, where you placed one supposedly said something, a patch near the eye, a patch by the lip, a patch on the cheek, each carrying its own quiet implication that a knowing observer could read at a glance. It was, in essence, a 17th century status update, except it was glued to your face, and one careless placement could broadcast something you never intended to announce. The beauty patch served a genuinely practical purpose that made it universally appealing. In an era when scars from illness, blemishes, and the damage caused by harsh cosmetics were common, a small dark patch of silk offered an easy fix. Rather than hiding a mark entirely, you simply placed a charming little shape directly over it, turning a flaw into a deliberate feature. The contrast was part of the appeal. Against the fashionably pale, powdered skin of the court, a small black patch stood out sharply, drawing the eye and emphasizing just how white the surrounding complexion appeared. It functioned as a beauty trick as much as a cover-up, a tiny dark accent that made pale skin look even paler, lending the whole face a certain playful, adorned quality. But the truly delightful layer here is the supposed hidden meaning behind placement. The location of your patch was said to communicate something specific, a coded visual language understood by those fluent in it. A patch in one spot suggested one thing, a patch elsewhere suggested something else entirely. The face became a small, personal canvas of signals, and a knowing observer could, in theory, read your patches the way you might read a message. Whether every courtier rigorously followed a strict code, or simply enjoyed the general atmosphere of flirtatious mystery it created, the effect was the same. Your patches became part of your presentation, another small element considered and arranged with intention. Placement was never entirely innocent. It was a choice, and at Versailles, choices were always interpreted by someone. This opened the door to the same anxieties governing everything else at court. If placement genuinely carried meaning, a careless placement might accidentally send a message you never meant to send, broadcasting something unintended to a room full of people fluent in the code. Even the smallest possible accessory carried its own small risk. There's something almost strikingly modern in this, the idea that a tiny visual choice could communicate volumes to those who knew how to interpret it. A court starved for entertainment turned even the placement of a scrap of silk into a game of meaning and observation. Nothing escaped interpretation. Even a speck on your cheek was pressed into the endless work of declaring who you were. Compare this to your own approach to a blemish, either ignoring it entirely or dabbing on something to cover it, without a second thought. At Versailles, covering a spot was an opportunity to make a statement, whether you meant to or not. Now let's return to the foundation of the entire silhouette, the rigid garment quietly doing all the suffering underneath everything else. Part 16. The garment that did the suffering. Let's return to the true foundation of the outfit, the stays. Long before the outer gown ever went on, your torso was laced into a stiffened, boned bodice designed to force your body into the fashionable shape of the era, a shape the human body was never naturally inclined to make on its own. Breathing became something you did in careful, shallow amounts. Bending at the waist became a distant memory. Sitting down turned into a genuine engineering challenge. You stood rigidly upright, not out of pride, but because the bonding simply gave you no other option. On the bright side, your posture was flawless. On the considerably less bright side, you might faint directly into the punch. Stays formed the structural foundation of fashionable dress, a stiffened, boned garment worn directly against the body, beneath everything else. Their job was to shape the torso, flattening, smoothing, and molding it into the rigid, cone-like silhouette that the era's gowns were designed around. Everything else, the silk, the lace, the grandeur, was layered on top of this uncompromising foundation. The stiffening came from strips of rigid material, most famously whalebone, sewn into channels within the garment and arranged to hold the body in a fixed shape, resisting any attempt to slouch or relax. Once laced in, you were held, your torso transformed from a flexible part of your body into something closer to a fixed structure, locked into an elegant, unyielding posture you couldn't abandon even if you desperately wanted to. The consequences for movement were significant. Bending at the waist became difficult or outright impossible. Twisting was restricted. Reaching down for something turned into a full-body maneuver, requiring you to lower your entire rigid torso as a single unit rather than simply bending forward. The stays imposed a particular, deliberate way of moving through the world, because the alternative, natural, spontaneous movement simply wasn't available anymore. Breathing itself was affected. Laced tightly enough to achieve the fashionable silhouette, the stays compressed the torso in ways that limited how deeply you could breathe, particularly during exertion or in a hot, crowded hall. This is precisely where the era's famous fainting spells came from. A tightly laced person standing for hours in a warm, stuffy room, unable to draw a genuinely deep breath, was a person genuinely at risk of going down in a heap of silk. And yet the stays weren't seen purely as instruments of torture by the people wearing them. The upright, controlled posture they enforced was considered proper, dignified, even essential to appearing respectable and well-bred. A straight back and a composed bearing signaled good breeding. The discomfort was simply the price of appearing correct, and appearing correct was worth nearly any amount of physical misery at Versailles. There's a grim internal logic to how it all stacked together. The stays created the shape. The gown displayed the wealth. The whole ensemble demanded a rigid, graceful bearing that the stays conveniently, forcibly provided. Suffering and elegance weren't opposites in this world, they were partners. You couldn't have the beautiful, dignified silhouette without the breath-restricting garment underneath, so you accepted one in exchange for the other, quietly, for hours, without complaint. Compare this to your own foundation garments, chosen largely for comfort, easily removed, and never once responsible for a fainting spell at a party. The people of Versailles laced themselves into rigid cages of bone and stood upright through entire evenings on shallow breaths and sheer determination. Now let's move from the suffering underneath to the dazzling display on top, and to the jewels that were less about beauty than about raw, calculated power. Part 17. A competition nobody admitted to. At Versailles, jewels were never simply pretty. They were power, worn openly on the body, and the largest, brightest stones belonged to the people at the very top. Diamonds seemed to flow endlessly around the highest ranks, while everyone standing below eyed them with a careful mixture of envy and quiet arithmetic. Wearing jewels above your actual station was a genuinely risky move, the kind of overreach that got you whispered about behind a fluttering fan for weeks. So you learned quickly to read an entire room by its glitter, sizing up exactly who outranked whom based purely on how blindingly reflective their chest happened to be. It was a competition nobody openly admitted to entering, and everyone was quietly, desperately trying to win. Jewels functioned as a portable, wearable declaration of wealth and status, and the underlying logic was almost brutally simple. The more magnificent your jewels, the more important you were understood to be. Great stones, elaborate settings, and dazzling profusions of gems marked out the highest ranks, so that a person standing could be roughly estimated at a glance, just from the sheer quantity of light bouncing off their body. Diamonds occupied a special place at the top of this glittering hierarchy, prized for their brilliance and their expense, clustering thickly around royalty and the highest nobility. To be genuinely dripping in fine diamonds was to occupy, or at least convincingly claim, the very summit of society. The stones caught candlelight and threw it back in dazzling flashes, making their wearers the literal center of visual attention in any room, which was, of course, precisely the point. This created a delicate and genuinely risky game of display. You wanted your jewels to communicate your wealth and status clearly, but you also had to avoid overreaching. Wearing jewels grander than your actual rank could support was its own form of pretension, a claim to importance you hadn't earned, and it would be noticed instantly by an ever-watchful court. So people calibrated carefully, wearing enough to assert their standing without appearing to reach above it, which required a constant, sharp awareness of both your own position and everyone else's. And the reading went both ways. Just as you calibrated your own display, you were simultaneously reading everyone else's, sizing up a room by its collective glitter, working out precisely who outranked whom based on the magnificence of their stones. This was genuinely useful information in a world where knowing exactly how to treat each person mattered enormously. The whole enterprise was, of course, a competition no one would ever openly admit to entering. Everyone insisted their jewels were simply personal taste, a matter of beauty and nothing more, while simultaneously understanding perfectly well that the entire court was engaged in a relentless, silent contest of status conducted in diamonds and gold. The fans fluttered. The whispers spread. The scorekeeping never stopped, all beneath a perfectly polite surface. Compare this to your own relationship with jewelry, where a piece can simply be something you like, worn because it pleases you, and for no other reason at all. Now let's turn to a beauty ideal people were, quite literally, poisoning themselves to achieve. Part 18. The poison in the powder. At court, fashionable skin was impossibly pale, so white it seemed to glow from within. And to achieve that look, people covered their faces daily in cosmetics that were, to put it gently, extremely bad for them. Many of the whitening pastes used at the time contained lead. Yes, actual lead, applied to the face day after day in the name of beauty. Over time, it damaged the very skin it was meant to perfect, which led people to apply even more of it to hide the damage. A horrifying cycle that would make any modern dermatologist need to sit down. The ideal was extreme paleness, skin so white it suggested a life lived entirely indoors, away from sun and labor. Pale skin signaled that you weren't a person who worked outdoors, weathered by the elements. You were someone of leisure, sheltered and refined. Whiteness was aspirational, a visible marker of rank, and people pursued it with a determination that overrode any concern for their long-term health. To achieve this unnatural paleness, they turned to cosmetics, pale pastes and powders applied to the face and exposed skin to create the desired luminous whiteness. The trouble was that some of the most effective whitening preparations of the era relied on genuinely toxic ingredients, lead chief among them, a substance we now understand to be seriously poisonous. People were, in effect, painting their faces with poison, day after day, in pursuit of an ideal. The effects were as grim as they were predictable. Prolonged use of lead-based cosmetics damaged the skin, causing precisely the kind of deterioration and blemishing the makeup was originally meant to conceal. The poison quietly ate away at the complexion it was supposed to perfect, creating exactly the sort of damage that drove people to apply even more of it in response. It was a vicious, self-defeating loop, beauty and harm feeding continuously into one another. Think about the horror hidden inside that cycle. You apply the paste to look flawless. The paste damages your skin. To hide the damage, you apply more paste. The additional paste causes further damage. Round and round it went, the pursuit of the ideal steadily destroying the very face it was meant to beautify, with no real winning move available, only a slow accumulation of harm dressed up as glamour. And this wasn't some fringe practice indulged in by a reckless few. The pale ideal was widespread across fashionable court society, which meant the poisoning was widespread too. People genuinely didn't understand the danger the way we do now, so they pursued the look with a clear conscience, unaware their daily beauty routine was quietly working against them. Ignorance made the whole practice possible. Fashion made it irresistible. There's a dark lesson buried in all that white paste, about how far people will go in pursuit of a beauty ideal, and how an entire society can chase something genuinely harmful simply because it's fashionable and everyone else is doing it too. Compare this to your own relationship with cosmetics today, backed by regulation and testing, and a general understanding of what shouldn't go on your face. The people of Versailles chased an impossible paleness straight into real, lasting harm, layer by glamorous layer, never fully understanding what it was costing them. Now let's step into one of the strangest ceremonies in the entire palace, the sacred, deeply serious ritual of watching the king get dressed. Part 19. Fighting for the honor of a sock. Every morning, the most powerful man in France woke up and performed a formal ritual known as the lever, a carefully staged public ceremony in which a select group of nobles gathered to help him rise from bed and dress for the day. And this was considered an enormous honor. Handing the king his shirt was a privilege genuinely fought over by dukes. There was a strict, precise pecking order determining exactly who was permitted to pass which garment, and touching the wrong item at the wrong moment could ripple through the entire court like a scandal. Picture an entire room of grown, powerful aristocrats competing fiercely for the right to help someone put on a sock. That was the seriousness with which Versailles treated getting dressed. The lever transformed the private, mundane act of waking up and dressing into a public event of real significance. The king didn't simply rise and dress in solitude, the way an ordinary person might. His rising was witnessed, attended, and assisted by a carefully selected group of nobles, each of whom considered their presence a mark of tremendous personal favor. The ceremony followed elaborate, precise choreography. There was a strict order to who was admitted, where they stood, and which small task each person performed in the king's dressing, handing over a particular garment, holding a particular item, assisting with one particular part of the routine. Every role was distributed according to rank and favor, and every single one functioned as a coveted honor rather than a servant's chore. This is the detail that really reveals the strangeness of the whole system. Helping the king into his shirt wasn't a menial task dispatched quickly and forgotten. It was a genuinely competed for privilege, a visible sign that you were close enough to the king to be entrusted with the intimate business of his morning routine. Performing even the smallest role in the ceremony carried real, tangible prestige. The precise choreography meant even the smallest details mattered enormously. Who handed over which item, and in what exact order, mapped directly onto the invisible hierarchy of the entire court. Performing your role correctly reinforced your standing. A misstep, a task performed by the wrong person, or out of sequence, could quietly disturb the delicate balance of precedence that Versailles nobles guarded so fiercely. Consider what this meant for the king himself. His entire morning routine, the ordinary business of waking and dressing that everyone on earth goes through, was conducted in front of an audience, staged as a performance with a strict protocol governing every gesture. Privacy, in any sense you'd recognize, simply didn't exist for him. Even his rising belonged to the court, structured entirely by its rules. And the nobles submitted to this arrangement eagerly, because proximity to the king was the ultimate currency at Versailles. To be present at the lever, to hold any role within it, was to demonstrate your closeness to the source of every favor and every advancement available at court. The ceremony functioned, in a real sense, as a daily ranking of the entire court, played out through the mundane details of one man getting dressed. There's something both absurd and genuinely revealing in the whole spectacle. Grown aristocrats treating the passing of a garment as a high honor, an ordinary morning routine elevated into something close to sacred ritual. It captures just how completely the entire palace revolved around the king, how even his most routine, private moments became a stage for the eternal competition for status. Compare this to your own mornings, private, unwitnessed, and mercifully free of powerful dukes jostling for the privilege of handing you your socks. Now, let's talk about the staggering cost of keeping up with all of this, and how many noble families quietly bankrupted themselves trying. Part 20. Bankrupted in silk. Looking this magnificent was never cheap. Every ribbon, every bow, every yard of embroidered fabric, every fresh outfit demanded by every fresh occasion cost a genuine fortune, and the court demanded an endless supply of occasions. You couldn't simply be seen twice in the same gown in front of the same crowd, so nobles poured their entire wealth into their wardrobes, some of them quite literally spending their families into ruin trying to keep pace. Picture spending an inheritance on a coat you'll wear exactly once. Now picture doing that over and over, year after year, because the alternative, appearing unfashionable, felt worse than being poor. At Versailles, going broke in style was practically a competitive sport. The costs of court dress arrived from every direction simultaneously. The fabrics themselves were expensive, with the finest silks and embroidered materials commanding genuinely high prices. The decorations added still more: ribbons, bows, trimmings, and lace, each contributing to a growing total. Jewels, accessories, shoes, wigs, every single element of the ensemble carried its own considerable cost, and together they added up to sums that could stagger even a genuinely wealthy family. Worse, a single magnificent outfit was nowhere near enough. The court demanded variety, and being seen repeatedly in the same garments marked you as someone who couldn't afford better, a humiliation to be avoided at nearly any cost. So nobles needed many outfits, continually refreshed and varied, appropriate to the endless calendar of court occasions. Each one a fresh expense stacked on top of the last. This turned an aristocratic wardrobe into an ongoing financial hemorrhage rather than a one-time investment. You didn't simply purchase your court clothes once and consider yourself finished. You bought them continually, keeping pace with shifting fashions, replacing garments that had been seen too many times, commissioning new pieces for every new event on the calendar. The spending never stopped because the demands of the court never stopped either. The result, for many families, was genuine financial ruin. Nobles poured wealth that should have secured their family's future into the bottomless demands of court fashion, spending down fortunes, accumulating real debt, and in some cases bringing genuine hardship down on themselves and their heirs. Money that should have passed to the next generation was instead converted into silk and ribbon, worn to a handful of parties, then set aside for the next fashionable thing. And they did this knowingly, or at least willingly, because the alternative seemed even worse. To fall behind fashionably, to visibly appear unable to keep up, was to lose real standing, to slip down the all-important social hierarchy, to be seen as diminished. In a world where appearance was everything and status was the only measure of worth that seemed to matter, being outshone felt like genuine catastrophe. Many judged the risk of financial ruin to be the smaller danger. There's a kind of madness in this, clearly visible from the outside but nearly invisible from within. When everyone around you is spending recklessly just to maintain appearances, spending recklessly yourself starts to feel less like folly and more like simple necessity. The entire court was caught in a shared spiral of competitive spending, each person's excess quietly raising the bar for everyone else, the whole system driving its own participants toward ruin in the name of never being outdone. Picture the noble who has spent his family into real debt for the sake of his wardrobe, standing in a room full of people who have done precisely the same thing, all of them beautifully dressed, and all of them quietly, financially doomed, unable to stop. Compare this to your own spending, where being seen twice in the same outfit costs you absolutely nothing and worries no one at all. At Versailles, that same repetition could cost you your standing, and avoiding it could cost you everything you owned. Now let's talk about something the elegant surface of Versailles worked very hard to disguise: the smell. Part 21. The fragrant fortress. For all its gold, its mirrors, and its glittering fashion, Versailles had a serious hygiene problem. Bathing was rare. The palace was tremendously overcrowded, and plumbing, generously speaking, remained mostly aspirational. So how did the most fashionable court in Europe cope? Perfume. Enormous, overwhelming quantities of perfume. Nobles doused themselves, their clothing, their gloves, and their fans in heavy scent, not simply to smell pleasant, but to build a genuine fragrant fortress against the reality of everyone standing around them. The result was a palace that smelled, at any given moment, like 1,000 flowers arguing loudly with 1,000 less pleasant things, elegant from a distance, genuinely overwhelming up close. The hygiene situation at Versailles was, by any modern standard, fairly dire. Bathing was infrequent, partly because of genuine beliefs of the era about health and water, and partly out of sheer practical inconvenience. The daily washing you likely take entirely for granted simply wasn't part of ordinary life. Bodies went unwashed for long stretches. Clothing was worn without the benefit of easy, regular laundering. The palace itself made the problem considerably worse. It was enormous and constantly crowded, packed with courtiers, servants, and visitors all living, working, and gathering within the same walls. Sanitation arrangements struggled badly to keep pace with such numbers, and facilities for managing human waste were simply inadequate for the scale of population they were expected to serve. The result was an environment where unpleasant smells weren't an occasional inconvenience but a near-constant background condition. Into this fragrant crisis stepped perfume, deployed not as a subtle finishing touch, but as something closer to a heavy defensive weapon. Nobles applied scent generously and often, dousing not only their bodies but their clothing, their gloves, their fans, and their other accessories. The goal was to surround yourself in a cloud of pleasant fragrance strong enough to mask the realities of your own body and to hold at bay the smells of everyone and everything around you. Scented gloves were a particular favorite, giving you a source of pleasant fragrance you could raise discreetly toward your face whenever the surrounding atmosphere became genuinely too much to bear. Fans did similar double duty, functioning as both a fashionable accessory and a personal air-freshening device you could wave into action at a moment's notice. The overall effect must have been genuinely intense. Picture a crowded formal room, everyone heavily perfumed with strong, competing scents, all of it layered over whatever the perfume was originally meant to conceal. The air would have been thick and dizzying. Flowers and musk locked in a permanent struggle against whatever lay beneath. There's a real irony buried in all of it. Versailles represented the absolute height of elegance and refinement, a palace of mirrors, gold, and exquisite fashion. And yet it was, fundamentally, a place you would not have wanted to smell. All that beauty rested on a foundation of poor hygiene and genuinely inadequate sanitation, and the perfume meant to signal luxury was also, quietly, a desperate daily defense against reality. Compare this to your own world of daily showers, clean laundry, and functioning plumbing, where perfume is a pleasant enhancement rather than an urgent necessity. The nobles of Versailles built a fragrant fortress because they genuinely needed one. Now let's return to your feet one final time, to the beautiful, delicate, thoroughly impractical shoes that completed the courtly look. Part 22. Tissue paper for your feet. Look down one more time because your shoes deserve a second, more disappointing look. Court shoes were genuinely beautiful objects, fine silk, delicate buckles, small decorative bows, dainty heels. They were also almost comically impractical. They soaked through the moment you stepped into the palace gardens. They slid dangerously on polished floors, and they offered roughly the same protection as wrapping your feet in expensive tissue paper. But comfort and function were never really the point. The point was to look like someone who never had to walk anywhere unpleasant, because truly important people were carried, or simply never went outside without an excellent reason. The shoes of the court were genuine decorative artworks, crafted from fine materials like silk and satin, embellished with buckles, bows, embroidery, and other careful ornamentation. They came in beautiful colors and elaborate designs, made to catch the eye and complete an ensemble. A fashionable shoe was a small luxury object in its own right, announcing, like everything else at Versailles, that its wearer could afford beauty over practicality. The trouble was that beauty and practicality sat close to opposite ends of the spectrum when it came to footwear, and Versailles chose beauty every single time. Delicate silk and satin simply weren't suited to real walking. They stained easily, wore out quickly, and offered almost no protection against the ground beneath them. These were shoes designed to be looked at, not used, and putting them to any genuinely practical use exposed their delicate uselessness almost immediately. The palace gardens were a particular hazard. Step outside onto damp grass or morning dew in your exquisite silk shoes, and they soaked through almost instantly, the fine fabric absorbing moisture and ruin in equal measure. There was no waterproofing, no sturdy sole to hold back the wet, just delicate material pressed directly against an unforgiving world. A short stroll through the very gardens surrounding the palace could destroy your most beautiful shoes. Indoors wasn't much better. The polished marble and parquet floors of Versailles, all that gleaming, reflective surface, turned treacherous under thin, smooth-soled shoes with delicate heels. You slid. You navigated glossy expanses with careful, mincing steps, perpetually at risk of an undignified skid across the floor of the grandest building in Europe. But none of this really mattered because the impracticality was, in a strange way, the entire point. A shoe too delicate for real walking announced that its wearer simply didn't need to walk far, or hard, or anywhere unpleasant, that they lived a life of leisure, conveyed rather than made to trudge about like ordinary people. The very uselessness of the shoe functioned as a statement of status, a way of declaring that you were far too important for the kind of walking that would ruin such fine footwear. So the discomfort and impracticality were features of the design, not flaws. Your feet might be wet, cold, sliding, and sore, but they were shod in beauty, and that beauty proclaimed your rank. Comfort was for people who simply didn't matter as much. Compare this to your own shoes, chosen for comfort and function, capable of carrying you through rain and pavement without a second thought. The nobles of Versailles wore what amounted to tissue paper on their feet and slid gracefully through the consequences, all to look like people too grand to walk anywhere at all. Now let's raise our eyes upward one final time, to the towering, gravity-defying peak of court hairstyling, a creation so tall it seemed to need its own clearance height. Part 23. A monument on your scalp. In the later years of the court, hairstyling went truly vertical. The style historians call the pouf was a hairstyle so tall, so elaborate, and so architecturally ambitious that it resembled construction work more than grooming. Hair was piled over padding and wire, powdered, curled, and then decorated with ribbons, feathers, flowers, and occasionally entire miniature scenes and objects nestled into the structure. Some versions grew so tall that women reportedly had to duck inside their own carriages and approach doorways with real strategic thought. Imagine your hairstyle requiring its own clearance height. Imagine sitting motionless for hours while someone quite literally builds a monument on top of your scalp. The pouf represented the literal peak of an ongoing court obsession with height and elaborate hair. Built on foundations of padding, wire frames, and supplementary hair, stylists constructed towering arrangements that rose dramatically above the natural head. This wasn't a matter of simply styling your own hair. It was closer to erecting a structure, a tall, elaborate creation supported by hidden scaffolding and requiring genuine skill to assemble correctly. Once the height existed, it became a canvas, and the fashionable women of the court filled it with real enthusiasm. Ribbons and feathers were merely the starting point. Flowers, ornaments, and decorative objects of every kind were worked into the towering hair, and the most famous, most elaborate examples incorporated entire themed scenes, small tableaus built directly into the hairstyle to reference particular events, interests, or occasions. Your hair, in theory, could tell a whole story, provided you were willing to carry that story around on your head for the rest of the evening. Assembling such a creation was a serious undertaking. Building a tall, elaborate pouf took real time, skill, and patience, with the wearer sitting motionless while a stylist constructed the structure piece by piece, arranging the hair over its supports, working in the powder and the curls, adding every decoration in turn. It was less a haircut and more a sculpture session, with the wearer serving as the pedestal on which the sculpture was slowly raised. The practical consequences of wearing this kind of height were considerable, and occasionally genuinely comic. A truly tall poof interfered with ordinary movement through a world built for people of ordinary proportions. Carriages became a real challenge, requiring the wearer to duck, crouch, or otherwise manage the towering hair just to fit inside. Doorways demanded advance awareness and a plan. The simple business of moving from one room to another now had to account for the monument perched on top of your head. And once assembled, such an elaborate creation wasn't something undone at the end of the day and rebuilt fresh each morning. The sheer effort involved meant these structures were often maintained over a stretch of time rather than freshly constructed daily, which brings us straight back into uncomfortable hygiene territory. Tall, decorated hair sitting atop a scalp that wasn't being washed with any real regularity meant the splendor on top and the reality underneath once again coexisted, uneasily. There's a wonderful absurdity in the whole enterprise. The sheer commitment required to wear a hairstyle actively fighting against architecture, gravity, and basic practicality, purely to achieve fashionable height. The poof demanded that you reorganize your entire movement through the physical world around your own hair. And the fashionable women of the court did exactly that, ducking and strategizing, carrying their monuments with practiced, hard-won grace. Compare this to your own hair, which requires no scaffolding, no clearance height calculations, and no strategic ducking through doorways. The ladies of Versailles built monuments on their heads and rearranged their entire lives to accommodate them. Now, let's turn to a moment when the most famous queen of the court wore something shockingly simple, and an entire nation lost its collective mind over it. Part 24. The dress that scandalized a nation. Let's talk about the time a queen wore something genuinely simple, and the entire country reacted as though she'd committed treason. When Queen Marie Antoinette was painted wearing a light, loose white muslin dress, the kind of soft, comfortable garment you might actually choose to relax in, the public reaction was pure outrage. To scandalized eyes, she appeared to be posing in her underclothes, undignified for a queen. Worse, the delicate fabric was imported, meaning she appeared to critics to be snubbing France's own celebrated silk industry. So a dress that was, by any reasonable modern standard, perfectly lovely, became a full-blown national scandal. At Versailles, even dressing down was a political act, and the queen had accidentally declared a kind of war simply by getting comfortable. The dress at the center of this storm was, by nearly any reasonable measure, appealing light, loose, made of fine white muslin, offering a soft, comfortable alternative to the rigid, heavily structured gowns that dominated formal court fashion. It suggested ease and naturalness, a genuine break from the crushing formality of the grand ceremonial gown and its whalebone architecture. To modern eyes, it reads as refreshing, even charming. But to the eyes of the court and the wider public of the time, the simplicity itself was precisely the problem. A queen was expected to embody the grandeur and formality of her position, to dress in a way that visibly reflected the majesty of the crown. The light muslin dress seemed to abandon all of that entirely. To scandalized observers, the queen appeared to be presenting herself in something resembling underclothes, a state of undress unbecoming of royalty, and a shocking departure from the dignity her role demanded. The informality read, to many, as a kind of quiet insult to the office of queen itself. Then there was the fabric, which added an entirely separate layer of offense. The fine muslin was an imported material, and by favoring it, the queen appeared to be turning her back on France's own textile industry, particularly the celebrated silk production that was a source of genuine national pride and considerable economic importance. As you've already learned, textile choices at the French court were never merely personal. They carried real economic and patriotic weight, and here the queen seemed, to her critics, to be snubbing her own country's industry. So a single dress managed to cause offense on multiple fronts simultaneously, offending a sense of royal dignity by seeming too casual, offending patriotic and economic sensibilities by favoring imported fabric over French silk, and offending the whole intricate system of meaning that governed dress at Versailles, in which every choice was read as a statement. And this particular statement seemed to get all the wrong things wrong at once. The uproar that followed shows just how genuinely charged clothing had become in this world. A garment that in almost any other context would simply be seen as pretty and comfortable instead became the subject of real public outrage and criticism, essentially a political matter. The Queen hadn't set out to make a provocative statement. She had, in a real sense, simply gotten comfortable. But at Versailles, there was no such thing as an apolitical outfit, especially not for a queen. Compare this to your own freedom to wear something comfortable and simple without triggering a national controversy. The Queen of France put on a soft white dress and helped set off a scandal that rippled across the entire country. Now let's turn to the terrifying threshold every newcomer had to cross to truly exist at court: the formal presentation, an examination you passed or failed with your entire body. Part 25. The exam you couldn't study for. Imagine the single most nerve-wracking moment of your entire life at court: your formal presentation. To officially exist at Versailles, to be recognized as someone, you had to be formally presented to the royal family, and that meant appearing in exactly the right attire, moving in exactly the right way, at exactly the right moment. The correct gown was mandatory. The correct posture was mandatory, and a single graceless stumble could follow you around for years. It was an exam where the subject was you, the grade was your entire social future, and the answers included things like which direction to curtsy and how to walk backward across a room in an enormous gown without falling over. No pressure at all. Presentation at court was the formal ritual by which a person was officially introduced into the society of Versailles, the ceremony granting official standing and the right to genuinely participate in court life. Without it, you remained essentially invisible, hovering at the edges of a world that didn't fully register your presence. With it, properly executed, you became a recognized member of the court, someone who existed in the eyes of the society that actually mattered. Everything depended on getting it right, and getting it right meant satisfying an intimidating list of requirements, starting with your dress. The correct formal attire wasn't optional. Appearing before the royal family demanded genuinely magnificent formal wear, executed correctly in every detail. A considerable challenge given everything you've already learned about the rules, expense, and sheer difficulty involved in wearing court dress properly. But the clothing was only the beginning. The presentation demanded a precise choreography of movement, a specific sequence of gestures and steps that had to be learned in advance and performed flawlessly under the watchful eyes of the entire court and the royal family itself. The famous challenge of moving backward deserves special mention. Protocol demanded you never turn your back on the royal family, meaning you had to retreat from their presence moving backward gracefully, while managing an enormous, heavily structured gown with a long train. Picture the difficulty of walking backward smoothly and with real dignity, encased in a vast court dress, before the most important audience imaginable. It was a genuine feat of physical coordination performed at precisely the worst possible moment for nerves. The stakes made every element more terrifying still. This wasn't a low-pressure rehearsal. It was the moment that established your entire standing, and a serious misstep, a stumble, an awkward movement could become a lasting mark against you. In a court that remembered everything and gossiped endlessly, a botched presentation could follow you for years, a small humiliation others would recall, quietly coloring how you were regarded ever after. So the presentation functioned, in effect, as an examination in which you yourself were the subject being tested, and the test wasn't conducted on paper. It was conducted through your body, your bearing, your clothing, and your ability to execute the required choreography under enormous pressure. You couldn't study your way to an easy pass. You had to embody the correct performance, and the grade was nothing less than your future place in society. Compare this to your own experience of entering a new social setting, where an awkward first impression is quickly forgotten and carries no lasting weight. At Versailles, your formal debut was a high-stakes performance that could define your standing for years to come. Now let's turn to the small but non-negotiable accessories no proper courtier dared appear without: the fan, the gloves, and the muff. Part 26. The accessories you were not allowed to forget at Versailles. An outfit was never truly finished with just a gown and shoes. You needed the accessories, the fan, the gloves, the muff to keep your hands warm and properly elegant. And these were not optional extras. Turning up without the expected accessories was roughly equivalent to showing up to a formal modern event missing one shoe. The fan alone functioned as practically a second language, capable of signaling flirtation, boredom, or icy dismissal with a single practiced flick. So you carried these items, used them correctly, and above all, remembered them, because forgetting your gloves at court amounted to a small, quietly noticed tragedy. Accessories completed the courtly ensemble, and their absence was as conspicuous as a missing garment. An outfit was understood as a complete, coordinated whole, and leaving out an expected accessory left the entire presentation looking incomplete and improper. You didn't simply put on a gown and consider the job finished. You assembled the full array of accompanying items, each with its own place and purpose, each expected to be with you at all times. The fan was perhaps the most versatile and genuinely fascinating of these objects. Beyond its obvious practical function of cooling the air in warm, crowded rooms, the fan became a real tool of communication in the hands of a skilled courtier. How you held it, opened it, moved it, or concealed yourself behind it could convey mood and meaning, from flirtatious interest to cool dismissal to studied boredom. The fan provided a whole vocabulary of gesture, a silent language layered directly on top of ordinary conversation. This turned the fan into something far more interesting than a simple cooling tool. A knowing courtier could flirt, rebuff, tease, or signal through the careful manipulation of a fan alone, conducting a subtle, parallel conversation through gesture. Whether every flutter followed a genuinely strict code, or simply added a general air of expressive playfulness, the fan functioned as an instrument of social maneuvering, and using it skillfully was worth real effort to cultivate. Gloves served their own essential practical and social functions. They protected and adorned the hands, contributed to the overall elegance of an ensemble, and when scented, helped in the constant, ongoing battle against the palace's less pleasant ambient smells. A properly dressed courtier's hands were gloved as a matter of course, and appearing without gloves when they were expected marked you as improperly turned out, missing a required piece of the whole. The muff addressed a genuinely real problem: cold, in a drafty, difficult-to-heat palace. Offering a way to keep the hands warm while remaining fashionable, this soft, often fur-lined cylinder into which you tucked your hands was both functional and decorative, a stylish solution to Versailles' real chill that also added visual richness to your outfit. Warmth and elegance combined, which was rare enough at court to be genuinely worth appreciating. The common thread running through all of these accessories was that they were never truly optional. Forgetting or omitting an expected item was a real lapse, the kind of thing that would be noticed and quietly held against you in a place where every single detail of appearance was under constant scrutiny. You had to remember them, carry them, and use them correctly, adding yet another layer to the constant mental burden of simply being properly dressed at Versailles. Compare this to your own relationship with accessories, largely a matter of personal preference, where forgetting one is a minor inconvenience noticed by absolutely no one. At Versailles, the small things were mandatory, and neglecting them counted as a small but genuinely real failure. Now, let's meet the remarkable woman who commanded much of this fashion system from behind the scenes, the dressmaker who dressed a queen and rose to extraordinary influence doing it. Part 27. The commoner who ruled fashion. Let's meet one of the most quietly powerful women at court, a woman who wasn't actually royalty at all, the queen's own dressmaker. In the later years of Versailles, a particular fashion merchant named Rose Burton rose to astonishing influence simply by dressing the queen herself. Her creations set the trends the entire court scrambled to follow, and access to her services became a prize in its own right. Think about that for a moment. A dressmaker, not born into nobility, became one of the most sought-after figures at the grandest court on earth, purely because she controlled what the queen chose to wear. She was, in every practical sense, a minister of fashion, and in a place where fashion functioned as genuine power, that made her quietly one of the most influential people in the entire building. Rose Burton was a marchand de modes, a fashion merchant and dressmaker whose talent and ambition carried her to a position of remarkable influence at the very heart of the French court. She wasn't born into nobility, didn't inherit rank or title of any kind, and yet through pure skill in creating fashion, she reached a height of prominence that few outsiders could ever realistically hope to achieve. Her rise stands as a genuine anomaly in a world so rigidly ordered by birth and inherited status. The foundation of her influence was her role in dressing Queen Marie Antoinette. As the creator of the Queen's fashions, Burton held a uniquely powerful position, because what the Queen wore mattered enormously to the entire court. The Queen functioned as the ultimate fashion authority, the figure everyone watched and imitated, and the person who determined the Queen's wardrobe therefore held tremendous sway over the direction of fashion for the entire court, and increasingly, well beyond it. This gave Burton an influence reaching far past the simple making of individual garments. The trends she created for the Queen rippled outward, setting the styles that fashionable society scrambled to adopt. When the Queen appeared in one of Burton's creations, the court took immediate note, and the wider fashionable world followed close behind. Burton was, in effect, shaping the tastes of an entire society through the single most visible woman in the country. Access to her became genuinely valuable in itself, a prize that the fashionable and ambitious actively sought after. To be dressed by the Queen's own fashion merchant, to have access to the very source of the trends everyone else was chasing, carried real, tangible prestige. Burton was in a position to grant or withhold something genuinely desirable, and this ability to confer fashionable legitimacy added yet another dimension to her considerable influence. The truly remarkable thing about all of this is how thoroughly it inverted the usual order of Versailles. This was a world obsessed with birth, where status flowed from ancestry and inherited title, where an outsider could expect to remain firmly outside forever. And yet here was a woman of no noble birth wielding real power at the very center of the court, sought after by aristocrats, shaping the tastes of the highest society, all because she had mastered the one thing this world valued with real intensity: fashion. In a place where clothing functioned as power, the person who controlled the most important clothing held a form of power that transcended the ordinary rules of birth. Burton's influence stands as testament to just how seriously Versailles took its fashion, seriously enough that genuine mastery of it could elevate a commoner to a position of real prominence among the nobility. She proved that at Versailles, the ability to dress the powerful was itself a kind of power. Compare this to the modern world, where a talented designer can genuinely rise to fame and influence through skill alone. Burton stands as an early, striking example of exactly that, ascending through pure talent, in a world that otherwise reserved its heights for the highborn. Now, let's zoom out from individual figures to the bigger picture, to how the fabric on your back was quietly tied to the economic health of an entire kingdom. Part 28. Your gown was national policy. Let's zoom out for a moment, because your outfit was never purely about vanity. It was, in a very real sense, national economic policy stitched directly into silk. France's silk industry, centered in the city of Lyon, was a source of enormous national pride and enormous income, and the court dressed accordingly. Wearing French silk wasn't simply fashionable. It was patriotic, a way of keeping wealth and prestige circulating inside the kingdom rather than flowing out of it. This is precisely why choices about fabric mattered so much, and why snubbing French textiles in favor of imported ones could ripple all the way up to the throne itself. Your gorgeous gown was quietly propping up an entire industry, which meant that every time you got dressed, you were, in a small and slightly ridiculous way, performing your civic duty. The French silk industry, with Lyon at its center, represented a matter of serious national importance. It was a major source of income and employment, a producer of genuinely luxurious goods prized across Europe, and a point of real national pride. The finest silks woven in Lyon represented not merely beautiful fabric, but real economic strength, a valuable industry contributing meaningfully to the wealth and international prestige of the kingdom. Because this industry mattered so much, the fashion choices made at court took on significance far beyond simple personal taste. When the wealthy and powerful chose French silk, they supported a vital domestic industry, kept money circulating inside the kingdom, and reinforced France's reputation as the producer of the finest luxury textiles in Europe. The clothing on their backs became, in a very real sense, an expression of economic patriotism, a way of putting personal spending to work for the nation as a whole. This is exactly why the crown took such an active interest in matters of dress and fabric, at times actively encouraging and effectively requiring the use of French textiles. The demand generated by the court and the fashionable elite provided significant support for the silk industry, and directing that demand toward French products rather than foreign competitors amounted to genuinely sound economic strategy. Fashion and industry were bound tightly together, and the crown understood the connection well. The flip side, naturally, was that snubbing French textiles carried real weight. Favoring imported fabric over the products of Lyon wasn't simply a personal preference. It was, in effect, a small act working against the domestic industry, a diversion of valuable spending toward foreign competitors instead. This is exactly why an incident like the Queen's imported muslin dress could cause such genuine offense. It touched a real nerve of economic and patriotic concern that ran deeper than fashion alone. So the pressure to wear French silk wasn't merely about style, or even loyalty in some abstract sense. It reflected a genuine understanding that the collective clothing choices of the elite carried real economic consequences. Multiply the fabric choices of an entire court, an entire fashionable society, and you have a force genuinely capable of sustaining, or undermining, a major national industry. The wardrobe of the powerful functioned as a lever on the national economy, and everyone at the top understood this perfectly well. There's something both grand and faintly absurd in the idea that getting dressed could function as an act of economic policy, that choosing your fabric was, in a small way, a contribution to the health of the entire kingdom. And yet at Versailles, this was genuinely true. The luxury and vanity of court fashion were woven together with the serious business of national industry, so that the pursuit of beauty and status also served, whether the wearer consciously thought about it or not, the interests of the state itself. Compare this to your own fabric choices, made freely, with no thought whatsoever to national economic strategy and no consequences for any industry's survival. At Versailles, the silk on your back was tied directly to the prosperity of a kingdom, and dressing well was, quietly, a matter of patriotism. Now let's look at another way the calendar itself dictated your wardrobe, through the strict seasonal rules governing exactly which fabrics were acceptable, and when. Part 29. When the calendar overruled the weather. At Versailles, even the seasons told you what to wear. The court followed a strict, recognized rhythm of appropriate fabrics, heavier, richer materials for the cold months, lighter ones as the weather warmed. Switching too early or too late instantly marked you as someone who didn't understand the rules, which at Versailles counted as a fate genuinely worse than being physically cold. So you sweated through summer in velvet, or shivered through an unseasonable chill in seasonal silk, all because the court calendar, not the actual temperature outside, decided what was acceptable. Comfort was never the goal. Correctness was the goal, and correctness came with a very strict schedule. The court observed a recognized seasonal rhythm in its dress. Certain fabrics were understood to be appropriate to certain times of year. Heavier, warmer, richer materials suited the cold months. Lighter fabrics belonged to the warmer season. This progression was understood and expected. Part of the shared knowledge every proper courtier was simply assumed to possess and to follow without needing to be told. The crucial point is that this rhythm was governed by convention and the calendar, rather than by the actual weather on any given day. There was a correct, established moment to transition from heavier fabrics to lighter ones, and this timing was a matter of settled custom, not personal comfort or the temperature outside your window. You changed your fabrics when the calendar and convention dictated it, not when you personally happened to feel warm or cold. And this distinction mattered enormously. Getting the timing wrong marked you immediately. Switching to lighter fabrics too early, before the appropriate calendar moment, or clinging to heavier ones too long after the season had officially turned, signaled that you didn't properly understand the rules everyone else around you was quietly following. In a court where fluency in the codes of dress was essential to belonging, a misstep like this revealed you as ignorant or careless, out of step with the shared understanding that defined membership in fashionable society. So people followed the fabric calendar even when it meant real physical discomfort. Wearing the seasonally correct heavier materials during an unexpectedly warm stretch of weather meant sweating through your clothes for hours. Sticking to the prescribed lighter fabrics during an unseasonable cold snap meant shivering visibly through an entire evening. The actual weather conditions were beside the point entirely. What mattered was observing the correct convention, and observing it meant accepting whatever discomfort resulted from the mismatch between calendar and climate. This is a perfect distillation of the whole Versailles approach to dress. Comfort was never really the objective. Correctness was. The entire elaborate system of fabrics, colors, timing, and accessories existed to sort people according to their understanding of and adherence to the codes. Following those codes correctly mattered far more than any consideration of physical ease. There's a real, quiet tyranny in submitting your wardrobe to the calendar rather than to the weather or your own comfort, in sweating or shivering strictly on schedule because convention demanded it. And yet this was simply another facet of the larger truth about Versailles. That dress functioned as a system of rules to be obeyed, rather than a matter of practicality or personal preference. The calendar was one more master to serve, one more set of expectations to satisfy under the constant, watchful eyes of the court. Compare this to your own freedom to dress for the actual weather, reaching for something warm when it's genuinely cold, something light when it's genuinely hot, guided by nothing more demanding than your own comfort. At Versailles, the calendar overruled the thermometer entirely, and being correct meant being uncomfortable strictly on schedule. Now, let's step outside the palace gates entirely, to see how these rules about clothing reached down and shaped what ordinary people across the entire kingdom were legally permitted to wear. Part 30. The laws that reached beyond the palace. The rules about clothing didn't stop at the gilded gates of Versailles. Across France, sumptuary laws attempted to control what ordinary people could and couldn't wear, reserving certain fabrics, colors, and decorations exclusively for the nobility. The underlying idea was straightforward. Just by looking at someone, you should be able to tell exactly where they stood in the social order. A wealthy merchant might have plenty of money for fine silk and elegant trimmings, and still be legally forbidden from wearing them, because the whole point of these laws was that money was never supposed to buy your way up the social ladder. Your clothing was meant to keep you firmly in your place, whether you liked it or not. Sumptuary laws were regulations aimed at controlling consumption, and in the realm of clothing specifically, they sought to reserve certain fabrics, colors, decorations, and luxuries for particular ranks of society. The intention was to maintain visible, unmistakable distinctions between the classes, to ensure that a person's dress accurately reflected their proper station, and that the boundary between the nobility and everyone else remained clear and legible at a glance. The underlying purpose was the preservation of social order and hierarchy. In a society organized rigidly by birth and inherited status, the ability to identify a person's rank instantly was considered genuinely valuable, even necessary. Sumptuary laws aimed to keep the visible markers of status aligned with actual social position, so that appearance and rank matched up, and the entire hierarchy remained plainly visible to all observers. This produced a particular tension around wealth that didn't correspond to noble birth. A prosperous merchant, or a successful commoner, might accumulate more than enough money to afford the fine fabrics and luxurious decorations typically reserved for the elite, and yet the laws sought to forbid them from actually wearing such things. The point was precisely that money alone shouldn't be able to purchase the visible trappings of high rank. Wealth wasn't supposed to translate directly into the outward appearance of status. In this way, the laws attempted to keep the newly wealthy firmly in their place, preventing the kind of blurring that would occur if anyone with sufficient money could simply dress like a noble. The privileges of appearance were reserved for those of appropriate birth and rank, carefully guarded against encroachment by the merely rich. Your clothing was meant to reflect your inherited station, not your bank balance, and the law stood ready, at least in theory, to enforce this. Whether these laws were consistently and effectively enforced in practice is another matter entirely. Such regulations often proved genuinely difficult to police thoroughly across an entire kingdom, but their very existence reveals the underlying mindset, a deep, persistent concern with maintaining visible social hierarchy, and a firm belief that clothing was far too important a marker of status to be left entirely to individual choice and purchasing power. The impulse to control dress reached from the court all the way down through the wider kingdom. The obsessive concern with rank, the reading of status through clothing, the reservation of certain fabrics, colors, and privileges to the elite, all of it extended beyond the palace walls through these laws. The court's fixation on clothing as a language of status was simply the most intense, concentrated expression of a principle the whole of society, in its own way, tried to enforce. Compare this to your own world, where you may wear whatever fabrics and colors you can afford, and no law anywhere reserves silk or fine decoration exclusively for the highborn. Across old France, your clothing was meant to keep you in your assigned place, by force of law if necessary. Now let's step back and take in the whole magnificent, exhausting machine you've been trapped inside all night, and confront the truth it's been building toward all along. Part 31. The truth underneath all that silk. At Versailles, getting dressed was never really about comfort, warmth, or even simply looking nice. It was about power, rank, money, loyalty, and survival, all of it encoded directly into fabric and enforced by an entire society of people watching one another like elegant, judgmental hawks. Every color meant something. Every accessory carried a message. Every outfit was a small gamble. And a single wrong choice, a forbidden shade, an unearned red heel, a smuggled scrap of the wrong lace, could quietly wound your reputation in a place where reputation was, quite literally, everything. It was a full-time occupation disguised as a wardrobe, and by now you've surely realized the truth. You would not last a single day. Consider everything you've endured over the course of this one imagined day. You couldn't dress yourself, requiring a full team of servants to assemble you piece by piece. You longed for a blue coat you were legally forbidden from wearing, and stared enviously at red heels you hadn't earned. You laced yourself into rigid stays that made deep breathing genuinely optional, and wrapped yourself in fabrics whose very colors could get you into real trouble. You navigated hat etiquette, sword requirements, and the treacherous, coded placement of a small silk patch on your cheek. You turned sideways through doorways in vast panniers, balanced a powdered wig raining fine flour onto your dinner plate, and perhaps carried a towering poof that quietly fought with the ceiling above you. You worried about lace from the wrong country, jewels above your rightful station, and whether the calendar even permitted the fabric you happened to be wearing that day. You watched grown dukes compete fiercely for the honor of handing the king his shirt, and learned that even a queen wearing a comfortable dress could scandalize an entire nation. Every single element of your appearance functioned as a test, and the test never, ever stopped. The truly remarkable thing is that beneath all that beauty, none of it was ever really about beauty at all. The gold and silk and jewels, the elaborate hair, the exquisite shoes, all of it formed a vast interlocking system for encoding and enforcing rank, favor, loyalty, and status. The wardrobe itself was the battlefield, and the weapons were fabric, color, and accessory. You dressed not to please yourself, but to declare and defend your position in a relentless, mostly silent war of appearances. And the enforcement was total because everyone was watching everyone else. There was no single bouncer, no lone authority policing the rules. Instead, there was the entire court, hundreds of sharp-eyed observers, reading every detail of every outfit, sizing up each other's heels and lace and jewels, quietly filing away every misstep for future gossip. Courtiers policed each other endlessly and without much mercy. And this collective, distributed scrutiny proved more powerful and more inescapable than any single enforcer ever could have been. The stakes of all this were genuinely serious. A wrong choice wasn't merely embarrassing, it could wound your reputation, and reputation functioned as the very currency of survival at Versailles. Your standing, your access, your entire future all depended on how you were regarded, and how you were regarded depended enormously on how you appeared. A forbidden shade, an unearned privilege, a smuggled scrap of the wrong lace could quietly diminish you in the eyes of a court that never, ever forgot. So the wardrobe was never really a wardrobe at all. It was a full-time occupation, a constant, high-stakes performance demanding endless knowledge, vigilance, and expense, conducted before an audience that judged without mercy and remembered without end. To dress at Versailles was to labor at the exhausting work of maintaining your very self in the eyes of the only society that mattered, and the labor never, ever stopped. Now the conclusion is inescapable. You, with your comfortable clothes and your blissful ignorance of red heels and forbidden colors and seasonal fabric laws, would be exposed within the hour. You would wear the wrong shade. You would forget your gloves. You would stumble your presentation and slide gracelessly across polished marble in shoes made of little more than fancy tissue paper. In this beautiful, brutal machine of fabric and status, the truth is simple and certain. You would not last a single day. Part 32, Closing. So there you have it, a single day at Versailles, survived barely by the skin of your unpainted heels. You woke up unable to dress yourself, spent hours laced into whalebone that treated deep breathing as entirely optional, longed for a coat you could never rightfully earn, and slid across polished marble in shoes made of little more than fancy tissue paper. You worried about the color of your ribbons, the country of origin of your lace, the placement of a small silk dot on your cheek, and whether the calendar would even permit you to stop shivering. You watched dukes compete for the honor of handing a king his shirt, and learned that even grief arrived with its own strict fabric schedule. It sounds exhausting because it was. Behind all that gold and glitter were real people, corseted and powdered, quietly poisoning themselves with lead-based cosmetics, carrying towering hair carefully through doorways, and spending their children's futures on a single evening's outfit. They endured genuine physical discomfort, real social anxiety, and endless, unblinking judgment, all in pursuit of a secure place in a world that watched them constantly and forgot nothing. And somehow, through all of it, they still danced. They still flirted behind fluttering fans. They still found real beauty and meaning somewhere in the middle of the machine. So tonight, as you settle into your own soft bed, wearing whatever comfortable, entirely unregulated thing you happen to have on. Take a quiet moment to appreciate it. No one is checking your heels tonight. No law governs your favorite color. You can breathe as deeply as you like, dress for the actual weather outside your window, and be seen in the very same outfit twice without a single soul raising an eyebrow. Because history is often absurd, occasionally cruel, and endlessly, wonderfully human. And the people who actually lived it, laced up, powdered, and stubbornly carrying on regardless, were far tougher than their silk ever let on. Rest well, you've earned it.